I'll leave it here in case we need to charge.
Okay, so thank you. So I think everything is working properly now. And so this is the second session, and this really is interactive because we actually have one of the teaching assistants, Mary, is here. Now I'm going to see if I can move this. There's Mary. Okay. And so Mary will be reading some of the questions that were already posted, and we'll be reading any of your questions that come in. I'll also, be looking at the live chat. And so that way we'll actually be able to respond in real time, and if anyone posts any questions. So right now I don't think we have anyone on, but last time we did this, more people came on at the end. And of course, many of you may look at this video later because I may give some clues about the final exam. So the final exam is comprehensive, covers everything, all the material in the course. It will be all multiple choice questions, completely new questions. None of them are repeats from the quizzes, of course. It's completely new questions, but of course entirely based on the videos, lectures, and the reading material from weeks 1 through 5. So if anyone does come on, we can talk about week 4, we can talk about week 5, we can talk about any aspect or about the final exam, what to expect. But I did want to, it's all described, I think, of course, in the syllabus. You can read that yourself, but just to highlight, that's what to expect for the final exam. Well, let me ask you, Mary, have I forgot anything? Let me...
Yeah.
What am I forgetting?
I think we're good so far. We'll see if anyone has any questions regarding
we do have one question in the discussion forum, and so Mary is going to read this question, and then I'll respond. So
yeah, so one student asks a serious personal question. Professor Nelson, do you think we might as well do away with the World Bank Group? With 10% poverty rate, there does not seem to be a lot of work to be done. And as the example of Chad Cameroon very explicitly showed, it often does more bad than good. Apart from not being able to fulfill its claims on the ground, it is doing the work of NGOs. I'm afraid that their aim of equality and living standards is not reached. Worse still, I think, to the contrary, governments know how to cheat their way into international support, which mainly reaches the pockets of the already wealthy and the developing countries and prevents them from doing necessary adjustments in their own kind of way. My question, is the World Bank Group still necessary, or is it obsolete? Thank you for all of your support.
Okay, all right. Well, that's a great question. That's a really thoughtful question. Thank you for posting that question. Well, the World Bank Group has been criticized. I mean, these are very solid, legitimate points you were making. There's a famous book, Aid as Obstacle, written from the structuralist perspective, a critique of the World Bank Group from that point of view, that says actually the World Bank Group and other international aid organizations like the World Bank Group do more harm than good. Because that these institutions are just tools of the rich capitalist countries and the corporate interests that determine what governments in those countries do, and so they're just serving the interest of the wealthy nations and of the corporate interests. Of course, not the poorest people, as they claim that they are trying to do. But in looking at your question, I don't think that's sort of the approach you were taking. You were just saying I think, in fact, I would categorize, and maybe I'm wrong. In fact, you can come on. I don't have your name. We have your sort of internet handle. What is it? Heckin' Fan. Okay, so I'm Heckin' Fan. So it's a very interesting question you posed, but I would sort of categorize your question in the embedded liberal category. So you were saying that you're questioning whether the World Bank Group, the way it does things now, if it's actually effective. And I'm not sure that you're saying that it's the corporate interests that are driving the World Bank Group's actions are harming poor people. That didn't seem to be the category of your question. You didn't seem to be within the structuralist perspective, your critique, but it seemed to be more of concern about, is it really effective? Is it actually doing as much good as it could do? And so I think that would be more in the embedded liberal critique of the World Bank Group, right? And I think there's a lot to be said there. I mean, I think the World Bank Group people themselves would be horrified by what happened in the Chad Cameroon case. They would say there were many things that went wrong there. There were things that could be improved, lessons to be learned. So I think that they would agree that certain things could have been done differently. Perhaps, especially I think the environmental problems that were created in Cameroon probably could have been averted, right? There were some serious problems with that. But I think most embedded liberals, at least those who work with the World Bank Group, would acknowledge that there are problems and there are things that need to be done differently, but there still is a need for the World Bank Group. And, of course, we would need to break it down by its components. So if we focus specifically on the International Finance Corporation part of the World Bank Group, the part that gives loans directly to companies, to corporations, including multinational corporations, people at the World Bank Group would say, well, there is still a need for this because some corporations feel more reassured or more willing to invest in countries that they might look at, might pass over, or where there might not be investments flowing as readily as you might expect. And so that encouragement, right, that the providing financing from the IFC gets some multinational companies or some local companies to do investments that they might not otherwise do. And so, yeah, there's always room for improvement in the practices and so on, but there is still a need for that, right? And so I think that is one of the things that most people would agree with. And the World Bank Group is constantly learning from its mistakes. So don't take the problems that happened with the Chad Cameroon case as, this is typical, or this always happens, or this is something that is always bad, right? Because I think that's not the right lesson to take away from that case. I want to kind of redirect just a little bit because the lessons I really wanted people to take away from that case were how managers can make use of the World Bank Group, right? And specifically the International Finance Corporation, because when you have financing from the IFC, and in fact, I'm doing a full-fledged research study on this topic with another professor at Thunderberg. We are finding some very interesting results. And what we are finding is that there are a lot of benefits to corporations who take financing from the IFC. That for big corporations like ExxonMobil and those in the oil consortium, obviously they had reasons for getting financing from the IFC. They didn't need the money to put their pipeline project in. I think a relatively small percentage of the overall financing for the project came from the IFC. But what they wanted was the good public relations benefits that came. Right? And so that is one of the reasons that I think managers should make use of IFC financing. It can help you, make clear that your project isn't just to, promote corporate greed, but to, could be a developmental aspect to it. And yes, there can be times when, the projects go wrong. We saw, it didn't work as well as it should have in the case of Chad Cameroon. But so there's a good public relations reason to take this financing from the IFC, to work with the IFC. We also are finding that it deters political problems, right? Governments are less likely to do something bad to a company that has IFC financing because that would jeopardize the group as a whole. And again, the Chad Cameroon case isn't a perfect example of that. But we are finding, and we have statistical proof to show this, that governments or companies do this and are finding it to be useful for that reason to reduce the political risk. We are finding a surprising result as well, that a lot of smaller companies take IFC financing because it gives them enhanced credibility when they go to seek financing from other institutions, other commercial banks, for example. They can say, look, we passed through all the hoops and all the red tape and all the requirements to get IFC financing, so that gives us more credibility for a project. And so we can, it makes it more likely for them to get financing from other kinds of institutions. So to focus again, put the focus a little bit back on the management aspects of this, that is something I wanted to highlight. Excuse me. Now, Mary, did I miss anything? You can help me here. Last time I was here just going alone, but I think I might have missed some things in that question.
Yeah, no, I think that was definitely very thorough and touched on a lot of what we've been discussing on the discussion board as well. I think, though, a lot of the students have been expressing, in their personal opinion, more of these structuralist views of the World Bank Group, because I think that, when you said that you were assigning this to see how different managers can approach or use the World Bank Group, I think more people were outraged about what happened to, the people in Chad and Cameroon. So maybe if you want to touch on that a little bit more, we're kind of cultivating a lot of Marxists in the discussion.
That's
board.
too bad. That isn't my intent, right? Because clearly there are problems, right? The World Bank Group makes mistakes. This case highlighted, I think, one of the was probably not, in some ways, isn't putting the World Bank Group in its best light. But I think what it does show, right, is that I wanted to highlight this. In fact, it shows that there can be problems, but I think the World Bank Group itself has learned a lot of lessons from this case. One is, I think that, in these kinds of projects, there's a phenomenon known as the resource curse phenomenon. And when a country experiences a sudden great wealth of oil is discovered and there's huge revenues flowing in all of a sudden, and a government may not be adequately prepared for this, right? And the government of the country may not, be equipped to handle this, or may divert the resources to bad ends, buying weapons or something, as happened in the case of the government of Chad. Well, there can be real problems with those kinds of projects, but that is not a typical World Bank Group project. That is not a typical even IFC project. So I think the vast majority of these projects actually, do really provide some benefits, right? The jobs are created, industries are, strengthened, infrastructure projects get developed that would otherwise not be there. That stimulates growth. So I think that is really the main point of the International Finance Corporation. Obviously, there can be a structuralist critique that exists, that is out there, and the Chad Cameron case might, make that critique, easily, one that you easily gravitate toward when you read that case. But don't forget that there, most of these projects that the IFC finances are really beneficial to these countries and really create some lasting benefits. And so that's, it's not really considered to be a bad thing. It's a good thing. Most people, I think, that look at these kinds of things would agree about that. And what I really wanted you to take away from this case, and I'm running a new case myself that will focus on those lessons more than what you saw in the Chad Cameron case, but what I really want you to take away is how getting IFC financing can be a useful thing for managers to do because of the public relations benefits, because of the reduced political risk, and then we are finding that there are even some other additional benefits, especially for smaller companies. It can enhance your credibility when you go and seek financing from other institutions, if you can say, we have financing from IFC. So those are the kind of the management lessons to take away from that session. Let us see now. We don't have another live session for week 5.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mary, are there any other sort of themes? You know, I've been glancing through and commenting here and there on the discussion forum, but are there any kind of themes that might stand out or grab you that you might want to mention here and that I can address?
Yeah, I think there's the one that I just like mentioned too, but I think another one, just because like the World Bank Group one has been like the most popular so far, is that they're suggesting not so much that the World Bank Group shouldn't exist, or that you know, they shouldn't be like giving money to projects like this, but that it's about who they're giving to. So let's say with like the ExxonMobil case, do you think that they should have given the money to other companies that are based in those countries? Or do you think that it's more appropriate to give to these like larger corporations who can have like a higher impact? That seemed like to be like one of those questions the students had.
Yeah, so that's a great question too. So, you know, this particular project, I think the World Bank Group, as the case explains, I mean, there were questions about it from the beginning. You know, is this really the best project? You know, the concern, I think, what they saw is the potential opportunity, right, for a country like Chad and a country like Cameroon that are so poor and that have really lacked resources to such an extent. And this was potentially, right, an opportunity, if it was done right, where there could be massive flows of monies into development-related projects. And so, yes, it's a big project. Yes, it's ExxonMobil. But remember, the people at the World Bank Group are liberals. They believe in win-win. Yes, we'll give some financing to ExxonMobil. Yes, that will be good public relations for them, that they're working with the World Bank Group, that will. But there could be potentially great benefits going to Chad and Cameroon. Now, this project, you know, if the World Bank Group had not received IFC financing, they might have skipped over Chad and Cameroon. They might have gone somewhere else, right? So that is the embedded liberal idea of the World Bank Group, that if we give them a nudge, if we give them a little bit of assistance, we're not interfering with market forces. You know, it's the oil companies that are doing this project, but we're giving them a little bit of assistance, encourage them to go to this country, right, into Chad and Cameroon that really, really need some money and need some assistance. And you see the World Bank Group made great efforts with the Revenue Management Plan, the RMP, to make sure, to try to ensure that the government would use the money for development purposes. And I really think, we must have I hear Mary is making indications we have a comment in the live chat. So yeah. I'm going to skip to that.
So we have a follow-up question on this subject. Are there any numbers on the results of the actions of the World Bank had on the ground in the countries that they worked with? Are there any real checks and balances?
Okay, so we're talking about not specifically IFC, but World Bank Group itself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the World Bank Group lives for these kinds of numbers, right? And so they publish these results every year in the World Development Report. And you can look at that, you can find that, and they have all kinds of indices and various kinds of measurements that they have. One that I mentioned in the lectures was the PQLI, the Physical Quality of Life Index. But there are various other kinds of measures that they find, you know, to what kind of return on investment are they getting, and not just financial returns, but, you know, in terms of actual development and changes in the literacy rates and infant mortality rates and those kinds of things. So the World Bank Group collects massive amounts of data on this, and so it does have measurements of its impact. And so I think that the World Bank Group, you know, clearly there are challenges, as we saw in the Chad Cameroon case, but there are so many other cases. So I hope I did not mislead you or lead you astray to think that all World Bank Group or IFC projects are bad projects or lead to bad outcomes. This one was not the best outcome, right? But you saw that even initially, there were hundreds of millions of dollars that were flowing to, build schools and roads and so on. And it was only after the government of Chad, the leader of Chad, diverted those funds away from those projects and began using the money to spend on weapons and so on, that the project failed. So I think that this one, the World Bank Group is operating in places that are very challenging, not easy to do business in, where the governments may not be the most ideal governments, aren't always looking out for the interests of their own people. But that's the kind of environment the World Bank Group is operating in. So inevitably there will be challenges. But I think we can look at the World Bank World Development Reports. And I think you will see, and again, these are World Bank Group numbers themselves, but there are so many independent studies showing the positive economic development results, especially from IFC financing. I think that can really have a significant impact. And so don't get misled by this one case. Now, do we have another comment posted in the chat?
Not yet, but I did share a link for the World Development Reports that you're talking about, so people can check those out. And it looks like they have them for 2016, 2015 on this link. But I'll definitely post anything on the discussion board later if there's like an interesting report that pops up with like those specific numbers.
Okay, she's promised to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then maybe looking into this week's discussion a little bit. So far, because it was just posted, there hasn't been as much discussion yet on it, but it's about the U.S.-Brazil dispute. And Professor Nelson, do you have like any insight on what you think about Brazil's strategy in this regard? If you think it was successful, or
now, are you asking me this, or is that a question that was posted?
I'm asking this.
Okay, she's asking this. Okay. So, well, right, since I did research and wrote that case, obviously I have some comments on that. And so I think if we're shifting gears now, we're talking, of course, about the World Trade Organization.
Oh, 1 second, actually, before we like completely change topics, the student followed up. He says, no, I believe they did good work as well. It is always difficult to estimate the results. I was hoping for some independent studies on the IFC financing numbers.
Okay, so can you elaborate further? Independent studies or independent numbers on the IFC financing numbers? Yeah,
so it would probably be, so the reports that I sent him are like the World Bank reporting about their own results. So then maybe it would be if there's any reliable sources that you recommend or publications where he can look up to see what the IFC has done and what their impact has been.
Yeah, so believe me, we're working on this right now. So go to the IFC website itself, ifc.org. And for one thing, you can find all of their projects, right, that have been reported. You're going to find all of the projects and the kinds of things that they're working on. And most of them are not these giant corporations that are receiving financing. Many of them are much smaller companies. Many of them are local companies in the developing countries themselves. And I think you're gonna see the nature of the projects are such that these are the kinds of projects that really are making I think a significant difference. And so those numbers are provided there. There are plenty of independent studies, I think, that will provide some confirmation of that. I'm not mentioning them off the top of my head, but I would look for an article coming out soon by Nelson and Gamso, and I'm the Nelson in that, and we are doing a study on IFC financing for some of these projects. So I can reassure you that most of these projects are not like the Chad Cameroon project, but really I think can have a significant impact. in a positive way. So now I want to shift gears a little bit to the trade disputes and the World Trade Organization. And I think that if we want to talk specifically about the U.S.-Brazil trade dispute over cotton subsidies, I know that sounds like such a boring, dry topic, because it is. But what makes it exciting is that here is a case where a developing country, right, very much in contrast to one of the articles I assigned to you. And again, remember, I assign to you sometimes articles that present very provocative or different points of view. So this, the article I assigned to you by Walden Bello was very much a structuralist critique of the World Trade Organization. And so it might be sometimes students read that article and they say, well, that's what's what the World Trade Organization is about. It's only looking out for the interests of wealthy nations, not the poor nations. But then when we start to look at some of the other facts and actual cases, such as this US-Brazil trade dispute, we see that here's a case where Brazil challenged the United States, the dominant, country, hegemonic country. You couldn't imagine a country like Brazil taking on the United States and winning. But I think you could say that that is what happened in this case. Because if you look at this, the United States was subsidizing its exports of cotton, and many developing countries, Brazil included, really genuinely have a comparative advantage in products, commodities like that, in this case, cotton. Brazil can produce cotton much more efficiently, lower cost than the United States, but Brazil was having difficulty exporting its own cotton because here the United States was, subsidizing, giving financial benefits to cotton growers in the United States so they could sell their cotton at lower cost, lower prices on the world markets, making it extremely difficult for Brazil to compete. So clearly this was an unfair, prohibited export subsidy. Brazil took the US to the WTO and won. The US appealed, Brazil won again. And what I think is what makes the case interesting is that the remedy that the WTO granted to Brazil, and then then Brazil's ambassador to the WTO said, we need something more than just imposing tariffs against the United States. The US will just laugh if we increase import taxes on shoes or something like that. I mean, the United States, that won't mean anything to the United States as a punishment to get them to stop the unfair practice. So Brazil said, we need something more. Can we revoke intellectual property rights protection on US pharmaceutical products and copyrighted products like software and Hollywood movies from the United States? That got the United States' attention. The WTO did grant Brazil that remedy. Brazil now had the authority to revoke intellectual property rights protection, patented products, pharmaceutical products. Brazil's companies could now copy them. Copyrighted products, Hollywood movies, Brazil, could just copy this, and it would be legitimate. The WTO was authorizing this. And so the United States said, please don't do this. So the Brazil trade negotiators said, okay, in return, what we will do then is, would you then give us a subsidy to our cotton farmers equivalent to the amount that we believe that we are, being penalized here by your subsidizing your own product? And the US agreed to this. So it seems like a convoluted solution, but what happened is, because US was giving that subsidy every year to Brazilian cotton farmers, when the US renegotiated the Farm Bill and began working through the legislation, and it came up for renewal in the US Congress, members of the US Congress said, why are we subsidizing Brazilian cotton farmers? And that's what Brazil intended. It was so embarrassing to the members of the US Congress and trade authorities that had approved this, that they began to take steps to eliminate the unfair subsidies. And they have taken some significant steps. They are not completely eliminated yet. But the US authorities have actually begun to reduce our subsidies of cotton, you could say that in effect Brazil won that dispute, and the WTO gave them the means to do it. Brazil didn't actually implement the remedy that the WTO granted. They didn't revoke intellectual property rights protection on Hollywood movies and pharmaceutical products, but they used that sort of as a negotiating tactic and a threat to get the United States to start modifying its policy. So here's a case where a smaller, poorer country actually won a significant dispute in the United States, against the United States. So I think in some ways that refutes the overall, critique that Walden Bello was making about the WTO, that it only serves the interests of the wealthy nations, not the poor nations. Here's a case where, in fact, the opposite seemed to be true. So don't take the wrong lesson from that Walden Bello article. There's more to the story than just that. I'm gonna see if Mary has any other questions.
Yeah, so no other questions have been posted by students at the moment, but I'm sure students will be curious about what they can be doing to prepare during this last week of class, before the final. What can they do to review all the material since the beginning?
Yeah. Well, as I just want to repeat again, the multiple choice questions on the final exam, and it's all multiple choice, will not duplicate in any way the quiz questions. That's a question that comes up sometimes. Hey, are we going to have to review our old quiz questions, or is there going to be a repeat of that? So that's not, these are completely new questions, but it is comprehensive, right? So the final exam covers everything from the beginning, from week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so you should be prepared for anything. Now, there also will be some questions specifically from the readings for those weeks. So I think it would not hurt to go back and look at the article summaries, right, that have been provided to you for each week. I don't think it would hurt to review any key videos that you might have missed or didn't completely understand. But many of the questions for the final exam will come directly from the readings, directly from the videos. So I think that might be the way to go. I don't think it would be of any use to review, old quiz questions or why did I get that question wrong. I don't think that there's no point in that. One thing I did want to say is we've been very impressed with your reflection papers. You seem to have taken that very seriously. These are very thoughtful papers for the most part. Have been for the most part, the research papers. So let's see, how are we doing on time here? I think we have a little more time.
Yeah.
And was there another question you wanted to? I'm moving it back and forth to Mary to break up the monotony here of me just droning on.
Well, one of the things too, and it's probably just because it's just been posted recently, but a few students have responded to the discussion post about the US-China dispute with GE, and how do you pronounce it? Gamesa?
Yeah, Gamesa.
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 Yeah. So if you can speak to that.
So I've actually, yeah. So okay. So what have the students posted? What have they asked about that?
Well, I think so far, fewer people have posted one because they've understood, being able to analyze it from a liberal perspective, a structural perspective, again, economic nationalist perspective, and the questions this week have focused more on what the students think, what is their personal opinion. So maybe all of these different ones have been circulating in their heads, whereas this one, of course, was were these firms and other foreign firms correct in not bringing a dispute to the relevant trade authorities? And maybe people have been a little bit shyer about posting on it because it's their perspective this time, not what this person thinks, not what that person might think, but what they think.
Okay.
So that might be something to be able to prompt students or give them certain ideas.
So, yeah, I mean, I actually think that this is one of the takeaways, or one of the lessons from this case, is that you know, the companies like GE and the Spanish firm stayed away from bringing the dispute directly to the trade authorities. For example, GE could have brought, you know, really made a big fuss that China was, you know, giving benefits, financial benefits to, you know, forcing companies to have a joint venture and giving financial benefits only if you had a certain amount of domestic content, right, in your investment in China, in the wind turbine sector. And China clearly was engaged in this economic nationalist policy. I mean, there's no question of what they were trying to do. I think we can explain it very simply from the economic nationalist standpoint. Purposely interfering with market forces, interfering, engaged in some unfair trade practices because they were, by this time, a WTO member. They joined in 2001, and so here China was clearly violating this prohibition on benefits, financial benefits to companies only on the condition that they have a certain amount of domestic content. So this clearly China was doing this to develop its own wind turbine manufacturing sector, and China was having great success in doing this. And you know that the foreign companies like GE could have complained to the trade authorities, and they could have, you know, pushed for a trade dispute to be brought to the WTO, but they purposely did not, because they knew there had been previous experience they had seen where companies that complained to the government or brought up these kinds of issues, the Chinese government in some cases retaliated against those companies, could actually kick them out of the country, could say, you know, we don't want you doing business here because we're bringing up these uncomfortable issues or raising these kinds of concerns. So the foreign companies specifically purposely stayed back from the dispute. Now, just the fact that they were losing market share to Chinese firms didn't necessarily mean they were losing money. The Chinese market was growing so fast, their sales were still increasing, but they were definitely drastically losing market share. So I think what makes it interesting is that the companies, though, didn't complain. They didn't want to face the potential retaliation from the Chinese government. So what they did is they let the United Steelworkers Union, you know, the United Steelworkers of America Union, brought the dispute. They let that union bring the dispute to the World Trade Organization. Well, of course, first to the U.S. trade authorities, and then the U.S. trade authorities began discussions within the WTO to bring a dispute against China. And they stood back and let the union complain, because the union, of course, the United Steelworkers, were very upset because they were concerned that they were going to be losing jobs back in the United States if China was engaged in this unfair trade practice favoring manufacturing in China. And so the companies purposely held back, let the union push the U.S. government to take this case to the WTO. U.S. government did take the case, and it was such a clear violation of the WTO's rules that China dropped, you know, the dispute, didn't, you know, stop the unfair practice immediately, knew that they were in the wrong, knew that they would face retaliatory tariffs from the United States. But it didn't matter. By that time, the Chinese industry had grown to such an extent that it could carry on without the subsidy. But I think what is interesting is that in some cases, one of the key lessons or takeaways from this, it may make more sense not to bring a dispute, not to push for a dispute to be taken to the WTO if you are in danger of being, you know, facing retaliatory actions by the government. Let someone else do it. In this case, it was the United Steelworkers Union. And I think the companies that held back in that way were savvy and sophisticated, smart enough to know that that was the right course, and it worked out for them. It worked out for them in a good way. So that's a lesson. it doesn't always, it may not always make sense to push for the government to take action against another country if someone else can do it for you. One other thing to notice about this is, the structuralist idea that the WTO is just serving corporate interests. That's one idea, but the structuralists would never think that a union would be able to, have an impact on government actions, or a union, workers, right, would have any, in a capitalist country, would have any ability to shape or determine what the government does. But I think clearly that is what happened in this case. So that seems to be a little bit different from the structuralist. The evidence doesn't seem to support the structuralist view in this case as much as you might think. So that's another point. Any other comments coming out, Mary?
We don't have any comments coming on the discussion board or the YouTube live session chat. But yeah, if there's anything that you want to add, or we can discuss a little bit more about this too. Some of the students had commented on the dispute that you were just talking about on the discussion board.
Were there more things that I didn't cover in all that long-winded answer I gave there?
Well, one student, I think almost the reason why people might struggle with the question in some way too is using the word correct. As one student says, is correct is an interesting term. Defining it is difficult. They say, clearly, since their respective bottom lines were not adversely affected and sales, in fact, increased, it can be said from a business perspective, their actions were justified. From a moral, ethical perspective, the same argument loses some wind. Yeah. So perhaps it might be argued, had these companies not capitulated to Chinese JV demands, normal market forces would have prevailed to allow an appropriate balance between domestic and international interests. What we have now is a major presence by the Chinese in the wind industry as a direct function of government intervention. The Chinese, in effect, lucked out by using the artificial window of time, which was 9 years, to effectively build an industry which might not have otherwise survived.
Well, I think that is a really good point, because yes, as a developing country, right, China was granted, when it joined in 2001, 9 years. So countries that join that are developing countries are given this extra time to become fully in compliance with all of the agreements of the World Trade Organization. And in this particular case, since China in 2001 was granted that 9-year window of time, they used that time to, in some ways, do things that might, if they had been fully in compliance with the WTO, they would never have been allowed to do. And one of them was giving this subsidy to companies that produce domestically, or to domestic firms, and these kinds of things. This, subsidies on contingent on domestic content are clearly a violation of the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement within the WTO. So it wasn't until 2010 that the United States could bring a dispute against China. And by that time, of course, the Chinese wind turbine industry was already well developed, had already taken significant market share away from the foreign producers. And so I think we see, an example of economic nationalist policymaking in action in this case. And that's one of the things that makes it so interesting. And yes, the WTO, in this case, it wasn't the foreign companies that brought the dispute or pushed the governments to bring the dispute, but the United Steelworkers Union. And I think that was a smart move on the part of those companies, because they might have faced retaliatory action on the part of the Chinese government. But of course, by that time, you could say in some ways it was too late, right? China had already taken such a significant chunk of the market. Very interesting case. It's interesting to me how China, the Chinese government, is prioritizing this industry to such an extent. They must see it as an industry of the future. Mm-hmm. I think in the United States right now we are prioritizing the coal industry.
Yeah.
But we won't go into those kinds of issues right now. But So, well, I'm going to turn it back to Mary for a minute. Next time, we're going to have Devika. Well, there won't be a next time for this course, but the next iteration of the course, we're trading off having the TAs assist with these live sessions. So we'll get Devika involved, the other teaching assistant that we had this term. But Mary, did you have any closing remarks or final additional things you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say it has been such a pleasure to be discussing all these different topics with you guys on the discussion board. All of you guys have such interesting backgrounds and experiences, and definitely have a lot to bring to the table, and are really applying what you're learning and analyzing all these different situations. So it's been really fun to read your perspectives. And seeing some of your papers too were very thought-provoking. And yeah, I would love to see the discussion as it goes this week. And good luck with your final. If you have any questions about studying for it that weren't answered in this session, please post on the discussion board, and we'll make sure to get back to you.
Okay, I want to just highlight some of those things that Mary said, because we've all been really impressed with the background of this group, and very diverse. It's interesting. It's similar in so many ways to the students we have on the Thunderbird campus. So I'm hoping that those of you that are doing the MicroMasters, that you'll continue on and do the Thunderbird online MGM program. Students in that program are also very outstanding students and diverse, and I think the kinds of discussions are similarly very high level, very nice discussions, and I think that you're going to see that the kinds of training you get in those Thunderbird courses are of the top caliber. So you've been a great group, and we look forward to any further questions you might have before the final exam. And we're going to keep looking at those discussion posts that come in. And it's been a real privilege to have you all in the class. And so I think we're going to sign off now. But any other final comments coming in at the last minute, Mary?
No last minute comments.
Okay. So I think that'll be it. And thank you. And good luck on the final exam. All right. Thanks a lot.